Hi there, welcome back. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create an attention experiment using the Gorilla Task Builder. And the experiment I've chosen to replicate is this one by Dalton and Fraenkel. It's called Gorillas We Have Missed, Sustained Inattentional Deafness for Dynamic Events. And this is a wonderful study. It's an extension of a very famous study called The Invisible Gorilla by Simons and Chabris. You might have seen it actually. If you Google it or put it onto YouTube, it's worth watching. In this study, there are two groups, two teams, a team in white t-shirts and a team in black t-shirts, and they're passing balls amongst each other. And you're told to count how many times the team in white t-shirts passes the ball to each other. After that, the experimenter says, "Did you notice anything strange in the video?" And typically, the participants will say, "No, not at all." So the experimenter says, "Okay, watch the video again, but this time look out for something unusual." And this time round, when they're not engaged in a quite demanding task, they are shocked to see that someone in a gorilla suit walks right in the middle between the two teams throwing balls amongst each other. The gorilla beats its chest and then walks out of the scene. And you might be thinking, how could I miss that? It was so weird. That should have jumped out. But it turns out that when we're really caught in a demanding task or something that soaks up a lot of our attention, we can become blind to these events. In fact, it's called inattentional blindness. And what this study does is it shifts it from being a visual question to an auditory question and asks if we experience inattentional deafness in the same way that we experience inattentional blindness. So I'm not going to go through this entire study in detail. The main reason that what I'm going to do with this section really is just show you how to find key bits of information in a paper to replicate a study in Gorilla. And I always start in the last paragraph of the introduction, because this is typically where somebody sets out their hypothesis. Now in this case, what they've done, which is really nice here, they've explained the stimulus. And they said we create a scene with one conversation between two women presented at the same time as a different conversation between two men. Halfway through, an additional male character walks through the room, continually repeating the phrase, "I'm a gorilla." So this is our stimulus, and you can see figure 1 shows you visually what that stimulus looks like. The men start over on the right-hand side and walk to a table on the left. The women start on the left and walk down to a table on the right. You essentially are the dummy head, and the way that the audio file is created, it's so clever. It really has this spatial quantity, so it seems like the people are actually, you're in the room with those people. You can see that the gorilla man walks by the men saying, I'm a gorilla, and past on the left-hand side. And what they say here in this, they kind of set out their hypothesis. They say, when you're paying attention to the women, you should be deaf to the gorilla man, because you're listening out for what a female tone of voice rather than a male, so it has different features. And also it's separated in space. The man walks past the men's conversation, so it will go through the left ear and not the right ear. What it also says here, though, it sets out our first kind of condition of the experiment. It says half the participants were asked to listen to the women's conversation, and then the remaining participants attended the men's conversation. Okay, so we've got our first experimental condition. And half the people need to listen to the men, half the people need to be told to pay attention to the women. There are lots of different ways we can do this, and what I'm going to do today is I'm going to create a standard static task, and I'm going to clone that task 4 times. You're going to see why 4 times in a second, because there's another manipulation further down. There are other ways that you could do this, and do get in touch with us at Gorilla to let us know how you've redesigned this experiment. Maybe you're going to use manipulations and spreadsheets. So now let's dig into the methods. If you really want to do a full replication, you probably want to know about participants. For example, they used 45 people, so we should probably aim to get 45 as well. You would also look out here for any inclusion-exclusion criteria you might want to think about. Now, materials, if you wanted to create the stimulus yourself from scratch, the materials in the apparatus are very useful. Thankfully, Polly has very kindly put the experiment online on her Royal Holloway website, so you can actually download the stimulus for free. So we don't really need to worry about those sections. So it's really just the last section now of the methods, the design and procedure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and do this as we read. I'm going to start adding things in. I'm going to start by creating my task, which I'm going to cunningly call task. And let's start adding in sections as we go through. So it says participants were self-paced, so they use a spacebar to initiate each stage. That's nice. It says as well that they had to listen to a recording to familiarize themselves with the realistic sense of space. I can put a little thing in here now, so I know to do that. What am I going to call that? What word did they use? So I'll just call it familiarize. You can rename it as something else later on, but we've put that in there now. So here we go. Now we're getting into the main experiment. So in the experimental phase, all participants were asked to listen carefully to the gorilla scene and to answer questions afterwards. So let's write instructions. We know pretty much in every experiment we ever do, we're going to need an instructions phase. And once we do this, sorry, I should talk about that. So I click the plus now to fill in screens. And screens, it's kind of like PowerPoint slides. You want a slide for each different element of the task. So when we present instructions, we're going to show them something. And we can either go blank and create everything ourselves, or we can take a template. And in this case, now rich text with a markdown continue button. That sounds good. That's usually what you want for instructions. Rich text rather than text is text that you can format. And if you click on this markdown guide, it's going to show you all the different formatting options. Gorilla gives you a head start. It says you probably want a heading, so it puts that hashtag there because that's the format to give you a big title. And then you fill in your text here. So let's call this, let's show instructions so participants know what this is. And in fact, we can just copy and paste from the paper. So let's take this section. Listen carefully to let's get rid of the word gorilla, we don't want to give the game away. Listen carefully to the binaural scene in order to answer some subsequent questions. We also know, you can see afterwards, half the participants were asked to listen to the women's conversation and the other half were asked to listen to the men's conversation. So please pay attention to the women's conversation. So what I can do, you'll see this when you go into Markdown Guide, but I know it off by heart, that if you put 2 asterisks around the word, it makes it in bold. So it just makes sure people know that they need to pay attention to the women's conversation. So, what does it say after this? Let's actually make our next block, which we're going to call task. And obviously they have to listen to the scene, so we need to create an audio zone. So I know, because I've used this a lot, I know there isn't actually an audio template, but it's really easy to make these templates, make these different screens. So I can just create a blank task, go to Edit Layout, Add Zone. It starts off as a blank zone, but I can now go to Content and I can make it whatever I want. I can make it text, an image, a video. I'm going to go with web audio, that's what we need. You need to look in the support documentation because that will explain why you should use web audio over audio. But that's now done, so I've got my audio zone. So the next thing it says is following presentation of the scene, participants were asked 2 questions. So we need to make a question box where they can say yes or no. Now again, we don't have text with text buttons, but I do have an image with 2 text buttons, and it's very easy to edit these screens. So I've just clicked now on Edit Layout, I click on here, and this zone is currently an image. Now it's a text zone. So now I can take this object and I can put that into my heading. And I can just type in here, yes and no. There we go. And then we have our second question, which I'm going to put in afterwards. So what it also says is that if somebody responded with a yes to either question, they were asked to give more details about what they heard. And they did this using a microphone. Now, I've created a blank screen for this, and I've added a zone. And if we go to advanced, we can actually put in an audio recording zone. However, there are issues with audio recordings. I think analysing audio recordings can be quite difficult. There isn't really any way around having to sit down and just listen to the audio files. Working with text is a lot easier because you can actually write bits of code that do a search for words in text. So, for example, you could just search for the word gorilla, and that would tell you what you needed. So rather than responding with an audio, I'm going to tweak this study for us, and I'm going to give a response text entry. So they'll see a little box where they can write in whatever they like. Now, as I move these white dots, I can change how big the box is. And you can see the numbers at the top and bottom tell me where I am in space. So if you want to make boxes match in different screens, this is very helpful. So I can make, it's always, if you just touch it as well, you can see this is 10, this is 90, that's 51 and 71. So I'll leave that as is. Now obviously as well, I'm going to need 50, 71. I'm going to need some content. I need to tell, I can't just put a blank text box in there. I need to tell them what to do. So here we go again. So we know that needs to be 10, so that lines up. This needs to be 90, so that lines up perfectly. And what I need to do now is fill in, let's see, ask to details about what they had heard. So let's just write that in here. Please write down any details about what you heard. And there we go. Okay, so we've got our main bit of the task. So we've got instructions, which I've clearly misspelled, so I need to just change that. We've got our task, so we play the audio file. It asks us, did you hear anything unusual, yes or no? And then it asks for this detail here, fill in some details. Now a nice feature about Gorilla as well is that we can copy and paste. So what I can do with this one is I can copy layout and paste. And now I've got the same thing here. And let's do that again for this screen. Copy layout and paste. Now all I have to do is do another copy and paste for question 2. And there we go. We've pretty much now created the main bulk of the experiment. If we want to pilot this and have a look, we can go to our spreadsheet. And just to explain this a little bit, I was given an analogy before that it's a bit like a recipe. And if you imagine that this part of Gorilla Task Builder, this is your ingredients. This is taking your flour and your sugar out of the cupboard. The spreadsheet is the recipe that tells you how to combine your different ingredients. And what you'll do in here is you'll add lines to your spreadsheet that tell you which items to use at different times. Under display, you're going to write down, if you wanted instructions and then task, you would write that down in here. You would say instructions and then task. And you can see this one's gone green and this one stayed white. And when it goes green, it's Gorilla saying, I found it. I know what this is. When it's white, it means I don't know what this is. And that's because Gorilla is capital sensitive. So I had it with a capital T, I've now made it a lowercase t, and it's all working fine. Actually, what I'm going to do with this one is I'm just going to have the task, and I'm going to leave that blank. So when I preview this now, it means that I will only preview the task. And this is a great thing for debugging. I don't have to run each of these sections. I can stub things in, and I can put in things I know I'm going to need at some point when I want to make this a really fully developed experiment. But for the time being, I just want to check the key things work. One bit I haven't done yet is put in a sound. To do that, we just need to go to Stimuli, and we need to choose our files. You can select as many files as you want. You could select everything and bring it on there. I'm just going to select these two for the moment. We can upload both of those. Depending how fast your computer is, that should go quite quickly. And there we go, you'll get a preview. So if you want, you can click play, and you can preview to check that it's the right file and that it all sounds correct. Again, thinking about debugging and getting your code working, this takes 69 seconds to play. And that means you're going to have to spend a minute listening to the audio file every time, which isn't particularly helpful. This tone on the right takes 1 second. So I'm going to use that in here. And that's just going to help me as I go through debugging to check everything works. So let's preview the task and see if we work. Okay, so this is something just because I've got the screen split with the paper. So I just had to make that a little bit bigger. Okay, you might have heard that there. That was a small tone. Now obviously what we want is to move on to the next screen, and that's not happening. So let's return to our configuration and try and see why that is. Now under configuration settings, if you want to know how a zone works and get more details, you can click on the question mark, and that's going to take you to the documentation. We also try to write these as kind of in layman's clear terms, so you don't have to know unusual terminology. And we can see here, if 1, allow participant to start manually. And that's set for 1, so that's fine. Media can be played up to setting number of times. Default is 1. If setting, advance when media finishes. Default is 0. 1 says advance when finished. So actually, we need to turn that to a 1. So what should happen now is that when the audio finishes, it automatically goes on to the next screen. Great, that worked. And it's got to our question, did you hear anything unusual didn't fit the scene? No. Write down details. We don't want it to do that. Obviously, we want it to skip this screen if we say no. So how can we do that? We can do that using branching. Whenever you have response buttons, whether it's an image or a text, it has this active response setting. And at the moment, it's looking to our spreadsheet to find an answer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change it. So instead of looking into our spreadsheet, I'm just going to say the correct answer is yes. And what I can then do is use branching, which says if it's correct, advance to the next screen. If it's incorrect, I want it to jump to screen number 4. And if I preview my task again, no. Excellent. So now that skips the scene, which is really great. And there we go. So in probably, I think it's been about 15 or so minutes, we've created our task. Now if we go back into our paper here, we can see that there is an extra bit here where it says, in order to confirm that all participants could hear under the original conditions, we ask them to listen to the scene again, this time attending to the men's voices and listening for anything unusual. So what I might do would be add a screen here with rich text, which explains that. Let's say listen to men. I can obviously fill that in later on with better details. And then here, I can just create a control condition, and I can just copy and paste everything from the top into blank sheets in the control condition. And then I start building everything up together. So there we go. We've built this task. We've shown lots of different examples here of how to start with a blank screen and put in the different types of zones that you need, or how to take a template and edit templates. We've also got into a couple more slightly complicated things, so using things like active response and using branching settings to jump between different screens. What I'm going to do now in the next video is show you how to use the experiment builder. And I'm going to show you the actual full experiment that we put out into the world and people participated in.